Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the floor of the Quarantine Bunker Studio. I am your man in Japan, Jay Contra, and I wanted to talk about a question I've been asking myself recently. So the whole impetus behind this video is I was looking at a showcase at a retro shop the other day, and I saw that the first Mega Man, Rockman, for the Famicom is now going for about 3,000 yen, which is around $30, give or take the exchange rate. And this is actually a big deal because I remember a few years ago, back when I was collecting Famicom games at a steady pace, you couldn't find Rockman for less than $50 here in Japan. So what is happening? Are we seeing a general decline in the price or the value of Japanese games? And will we see this phenomenon continue as as newer systems like PlayStation, N64 become even more older? So what I need to contrast this with is another game that I've seen around is Contra, the original Contra. Contra has in Japan been about $45 for as long as I can remember. Now I've heard and I've seen on price charting that the American version of Contra used to be like $50 and now it's back down to $20, and it hasn't been this low since I think in the last 7 years. So what do I think is happening? I think that in general, yes, much like America and Europe, what you're seeing is that like Famicom and Super Famicom games and their equivalents, the Nintendo and the Super Nintendo, in general, yes, the prices are going down, and I think that's what we can expect for Japanese games as a whole. I believe we will see prices go down in the future. I don't think that prices will completely collapse. I don't think you'll be seeing a return to the prices of the early 2010s or even the 2000s, simply because when you look at it on a macroscopic sense, people now actually value video games. Back in the 2000s, when you could buy Sega Saturn games for dirt cheap, Famicom games for dirt cheap, when you could buy Rendering Ranger R2 for like $100 or however much it cost, it's just that was because old video games were not valued. We're entering into a whole new system. Even still, I would say even within the last 5-10 years, we're still developing an appreciation for old video games. Now, maybe 50 years from now, when people like myself and our generation, people who actually value physical media, when we sort of age out and the next generation comes in who's been raised on digital collections and only basically renting their video games, which is the way I see it when you're downloading a game. Will they have an attachment to physical media? Maybe, maybe not. And maybe that's when the prices absolutely collapse because people don't want to see that. And they don't want the games anymore. But even let's just talk about the next 5-10 years. Let's talk about the trends of what I see happening to Japanese video games. What I mean when I say prices will decline in general, I mean that there are actually prices on games that will go up. And here's what I mean by that. We've sort of got two different levels of, I think, collecting mentality. On the bottom, which is where I would actually include myself, you've got the people who are buying and they either don't care about condition, they just want the game to actually play the game. And so that's sort of I don't want to say bottom tier because I don't want to, have a hierarchy of collector or anything like that. What I mean is just that in my case, if I find a copy of a game that, if the box has a couple of scratches on it or the cartridge has a little fold in it, on the label, I don't care about that. I would much rather buy a game at a much lower price. All of those games for the Super Famicom and the Famicom are going down. And that's because I think all of the money, all of the demand is flowing towards the super pristine copies of games. So let me give you some examples. On sort of the my tier of collector, let's just take like Wild Guns, for example, for the Super Famicom. Even Iron Commando, which is about in the same price range. These cartridges, for a while, you could not find for less than $250, even in the countryside. You would be lucky in Akihabara to find them for $300. Same goes for even like Mr. Gimmick. Mr. Gimmick in Japan for just the cartridge was about $300. What are you seeing now? I could go to Mandarake right now and buy a copy of Wild Guns for about $150, as long as it has some damage to it. If it was a perfect mint cartridge, maybe it'd be a little bit more than it was a couple of years ago. But a couple of years ago, yeah, you just couldn't find it for even less than $200. Today, very easy to find it for $150. Same goes for Iron Commando, a lot of other cartridge games as well. Now, there might be some uncommon games that maybe even in a sort of a damaged state, they might increase in price, but I just don't see that happening. Contrast these declining cartridge prices with what I've seen as just a general either holding steady in value or increase for the mintiest copies. And I'm using sort of as my standard here, Mandarake, where a couple of years ago, you could buy an A-grade, mint fresh copy of Dracula XX, or whatever the Japanese version was, Dracula X for the Super Famicom. Now it's going for like $200, $210. Now that's for a variety of reasons, because Castlevania games are just going up in price anyways, but also it's evocative of a trend of what I've seen for the highest caliber grade of a game is accumulating value, because that's what the collectors want. That's what the collectors who have money or are willing to spend the money on these copies of games, because they are the best possible. That's why I think you see that with sealed games as well, because people want what they perceive as either untouched or may as well be untouched video games. That's where I think there's a little bit of an increase in demand for that, but because those collectors have the money, that's where you see the money flowing. Whereas if it was a damaged box, if it had a couple of scuffs on it, the price increase in that is you just don't see the price increasing as either at all or as rapidly as the mintier copies of that game. It's sort of like, think about like card collecting. Think about how for Pokemon cards or Magic the Gathering, a PSA 7, it's like whatever. No one wants a PSA 7. I mean, I would love to have a PSA 7 because I just want the card, but that's not where the money is at. There is such a huge price differential between a PSA 7 and a PSA 10, even a PSA 9 and a PSA 10. We're talking about, just a nanometer of a difference in centering, or it might have just a little chip of white fleck on the edge of the card. That sort of principle, I think, also holds with video games in terms of that sort of the collecting mentality. That's what I see. And I also, in general, I think when you look at Japanese games, and I think you're going to see decreases in the price of Japanese video games going forward, particularly for the earlier generations of consoles. But I don't think the decline is going to be as rapid as we've seen for the Nintendo, and outside of Japan for the Genesis or the Super Nintendo. The Famicom and the Super Famicom, the games that came out for these systems, the way I see it, and I feel like the way a lot of people see it, is that these are the original versions of a lot of games, like Zelda for the Famicom. That is the original Zelda. So if you can find one that is complete in box, that is the game as compared to the localized versions that you'd find in America and Europe. So I feel like there is a lot more demand for Japanese games on a general level as compared to the American version, for example. So what I mean to say is that Americans will collect American games, Europeans will collect, French collectors will try and collect their French games. And there will be some crossover, like there'll be some American collectors who will collect PAL games, and there will be a very few number of Japanese collectors who will look for foreign games. But I believe the inverse is that you have so many people outside of Japan who all, on a global basis, everyone wants those Japanese games, where it's just not equal the other way around. So you have a very unique demand pressure on Japanese games that you just don't see for the other markets. So just to kind of sum it up and hopefully make sense of this video, yes, I see prices on Japanese games going down. I see it for the Famicom. I see it for the Super Famicom. I believe we will inevitably see it for the PlayStation and the N64, and then, of course, going on for all of the future generations. Maybe in 50 years, everything will go back to the way it was 20 years ago. So it will only have taken 70 years to go back to normal, or to what the price of games was in the year 2000. But I see prices increasing on the top quality games, not only in terms of rarity, because rarity will be a huge factor, but also in terms of the condition of the game. Condition is going to be, I think, much more of a variable factor as we move forward, because collectors will sort of hold on to their rare games, and when they have spent so much money on these things, I think they will be much less willing to part with them, particularly if they're in really good condition, because that's the copy that people want to hold on to. But hey, I am looking forward to buying more Famicom games and Super Famicom games at ridiculously cheap prices. Can't wait for that to happen. Although, something I forgot to mention, and I should have mentioned earlier, is that when you look at the Japanese copies of Sega Mega Drive games and PC Engine games, they have really seemed to have held their price. Now, I don't actually know that much about these systems, so don't take my expertise there at a very high value. But I've definitely noticed the rare games have stayed particularly expensive. Like, look at Sapphire. Sapphire is now, like, I remember a couple of years ago, it was maybe a $700, $800 game. It's now trending towards $1,000 plus. So you've seen pretty consistent demand for the Japanese Mega Drive and the PC Engine. And I think as long as that sort of demand holds steady, it's not like we're going to be uncovering any huge like pallets of these games anytime soon. So I think these collectors are a bit more serious. They're less casual, so they're not as ready to give up their collections as you saw for casual Famicom and Super Famicom collectors who were just ready to, you know, cash out, or if they just get bored with the system and they sell their games, or they just don't have, you know, they don't want to hold on to it for whatever reason, as much as the more hardcore collectors. Not making a value judgment on those two particular styles, just saying that's the reality that we're looking at. So I'll say it again, I'm looking forward to cheaper Japanese video games, and I hope you are too. I've been your man in Japan, Jay Contra, saying thanks for watching, see you next time, and mahalo.